start?
Jeremy, just say yes when you're ready.
I'm a musician, but my brother
Okay, I'm gonna start. Okay, Ben, I'm gonna introduce you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Good to see you. Welcome, CBS members, visitors, guests. I am delighted to introduce Professor Ben Brinner, as well as his wife, Lisa, also Dr. Brinner. We just had dinner together, wonderful couple, very talented, really interesting stories, and we're really looking forward to your presentation tonight. Just a couple words about Dr. Brinner, about Ben, if that's okay. We're old friends now, right?
Yes.
We had dinner together.
Yeah.
Ben has his PhD from the University of Berkeley, from University of California, Berkeley, and just retired July 1st after about 30 years, right? 30 years at UC Berkeley, and is now a professor emeritus, and I think you're still teaching 3 courses or more and writing. In his past, he's taught in Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University. I believe you did research on a Fulbright. Your dissertation was about Javanese music, correct? And we're going to hear something very different tonight, as you can see, mixing through music, explorations across religious, ethnic, and national visions in 1990s Israel. So as you can see, he's very intellectually curious. He has a wide range of subjects that he's interested and passionate about. And I am very much looking forward to hearing your insights tonight. So,
thank you.
Dr. Brinner, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I enjoyed meeting you over dinner too. To set the record straight, it's Dr. Gold. Is my, yeah, no, that's fine. So this is, and I want to thank Rabbi Goldstein for this invitation and this opportunity. As you said, I did my dissertation on Javanese music, which is really remote from this topic. After completing my doctorate, I moved to Israel. I had been there as a student. I did my BA at the Hebrew University. And thanks to some connections I had and just openings that opened up at just that moment, I taught at Hebrew University, at Tel Aviv University, and at the Jerusalem Music Center. At the Jerusalem Music Center, actually brought the first Indonesian gamelan to teach there. There was a program from non-Western music. And while I was there, so I taught there for 3 years until a position opened up at Berkeley, and I've been in '89, so it was 32 years that I taught at Berkeley. While I was there, because of this program I was running on teaching non-Western music performance of various sorts, I got to know quite a few musicians involved in Arab music. Most of them Arabs, some of them Jews. There were some older Iraqi Jewish musicians who were teaching, and some younger Palestinian, Israeli Arab musicians. And as I continued to go back to Israel through the late 80s and into the 90s and to the present day, I stayed in touch with these people. And what I found in 1991, 92 was that their whole situation had changed. What they were doing, what they were able to do, and what they were choosing to do had changed. And it made a really interesting story, and that's what I'm going to unfold here. I wrote a book about this called Playing Across a Divide, Israeli-Jewish Musical Encounters. And it sums up, or it tries to sum up, the period from about 1991 to 2007. The book came out in 2009. And this is a bit of it with some of the wisdom of hindsight, or the putative wisdom of hindsight, to think back on that period. So in order to dive into this topic of musical mixing and divisions and so on, I'm going to begin with a little bit a video that I took from the web. I didn't make this video. This is from 2014. So I'm going to be focusing on the 1990s, but the male performer you're going to see became active in the 1990s, Yair Dalal, and here he's performing with Lubna Salame. So here we have an Israeli Jew, the son of Iraqi Jewish immigrants. He was born the year after they fled Baghdad for Tel Aviv. and an Israeli Arab woman born in Haifa, specializing in Arab classical music. And this is a composition that I will talk about later this evening, but I just want to give you a little taste of what's going on here. They're singing, Zaman al-Salam means the time of peace in Arabic, and she's singing in Hebrew. He starts out in Hebrew and he switches to Arabic, and we will come back to the piece. I just wanted you to get a sense of what this sounds like. I'm just curious of the people here in the room, how many have heard of or have heard Yair Dalal? Any of you? One, maybe. Yeah. He has toured from Israel to the Bay Area almost annually from the late 90s. I first met him in Berkeley in 1993 or 94. The Israeli director of Hillel had brought him to campus, and I sponsored a workshop that he did. So I'm using this as an entry point to talk about a musical scene that developed in Israel in the 1990s. And I'm particularly interested in the interactions between musicians coming from very different backgrounds. So here with Yair and Lubna, they both had an interest in Arab classical music. But aside from that, their backgrounds were quite different. And Yair has interacted with people across a very broad spectrum, you'll see a bit later. Not all of and he has also been a very active exponent of peace. So he's performed in concerts calling for peace over and over and over again, including on the Israeli border with Gaza during one of the innumerable wars. He's performed, and the piece you just heard was what shot him to fame, because he performed that in Oslo in 1994 at the commemoration of 1 year of the Oslo Accords. So we'll come back to that again. Not all of the other musicians I'll talk about today were as committed to using music as a tool for to argue for peaceful coexistence, but for all of them that was part of the mix. So just to give you some sense of the complexities of the identities of people that I'll be talking about, and here's a slide I put together when I was actually teaching a course on music in America, although I've altered it to fit the Israeli situation. So an identity complex, what are some of the aspects that affect a person's identity, or by which a person might be known or might define themselves? So citizenship, in this case, we have active in this scene people who are Israeli citizens, people who are Jordanian citizens, and Palestinians who are neither Jordanian citizens nor Israeli citizens. They fall between the cracks. So Palestinian residents of Jerusalem have Israeli rights, but they don't have Israeli citizenship, for instance. Then there's religious affiliations. Among the musicians with whom I worked, there are Jews, there are Muslims, there are Christians, and there are Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, Druze. Ethnicity. Among the Arabs, there are city Arabs and there are village Arabs who see each other as related but somewhat different, and then there are Bedouin whom they see as very different. Among Jews, there are divisions that some of you are probably well familiar with in our tribes of Ashkenazi and Sephardi and Mizrahi. So there are these kinds of distinctions. Country of origin, I've already noted that Yair was born in Israel, but his parents came from Iraq, and he strongly identifies not only with Israel as being an Israeli, but also with his Iraqi heritage, and he has at times identified himself as an Arab Jew, because he feels that his root culture is Arab. At other times, he doesn't define himself that way. There's socioeconomic status, and you'll see tonight that I'm speaking mainly about men. When I started this research in this scene, it was mainly men playing. The situation is somewhat different now, and at least for my initial clip, there was a woman sharing the stage. So age, differences of gender, and differences of socioeconomic status expressed through income were rife throughout this scene. Finally, education and musical training and experience. So these people I'm talking about differed in all of these ways, and putting simple labels on them really is not comfortable, but just so that I don't have to make every sentence 2 pages long, I'm going to use very short labels and hope you bear with me. So in 1990s Israel, there was just a profusion of music available, and I'll give you a laundry list. There won't be a test afterwards, but most of the musicians I'm talking about participated in several of these streams of music, or they were reacting against them. So one was Western art music. In the 1990s, Western art music, so symphonies, operas, choruses, and so on, chamber music were all really, really strong with government support. They were part of the educational system. They were on radio, on TV. There was a national radio station that devoted, at first, round-the-clock programming to classical music. By the 1990s, I think they were cutting back, and since then, it's shut down. But compared to any other kind of music, this was the music that got the most governmental support. Israeli popular music was also pervasive, a very commercial endeavor with relatively little government support. And European American pop, so rock and pop, everything from Elvis to the Beatles to the Spice Girls on the menu. And actually, the man you saw in the opening video, Yair Dalal, when he first started out, he was very drawn to rock and roll and to blues. And it was only as in his early 20s that he pivoted back to his roots, the music he'd heard in the house when he grew up. And then there's something called Musika Mizrachit, which in Hebrew means Oriental or Eastern music, and which is very popular now, but had been suppressed or had been on the margins until the 1980s. In the 1990s, it was really starting to take over the airwaves and the CD stores. Some people call it Mediterranean music. It's music that is popular music that draws on Turkish, Persian, Arab, French, Italian, and other sources. People who don't like it tend to characterize it in very negative terms as sappy and sentimental. People who love it and really get angry at those characterizations. Most of the musicians I'm talking about tonight do not like it and saw what they were doing as something different that worked with some of the same Middle Eastern materials, but towards a very different and, in their eyes, a higher end. Middle Eastern music, so there's long traditions of Arab instrumental and vocal music, and Turkish and Persian. The Turkish and the Arab are very closely linked in terms of musical characteristics. The languages are different, though. And in the 1990s, you get immigration from the Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union, so musicians from the various stans, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and so on, coming to Israel and playing a very different kind of music, as well as a wave of Ethiopian musicians, immigrants bringing their music, which was not really very present in the 90s. It's now very dominant, very important. Many different Jewish communities with different religious traditions, and Muslims and Christians with their musical practices. A very minor but very powerful at the same time, kind of in a perverse way, jazz scene with some very, very great musicians who cycle between Tel Aviv and New York, and supported partly by a school that is a branch of the Berkeley School from Boston. So all the teachers, or many of the teachers, were graduates of that school, and the students go from Tel Aviv to Boston and back, or they stay in New York to make a life as a musician. Finally, various folk musics, American folk musics of various sorts, from old time to Bob Dylan in his early days to bluegrass, are all present. And some of these musicians were very conversant with it, and some were not at all. So the music I'm talking about came to be known as Israeli ethnic music and was marketed as such in Israel. If you went into a CD store in the 1990s, there would be a bin that was Musika Ethnit Israelit, Israeli ethnic music, and it meant kind of world music, but made in Israel. So a local manifestation of what was a growing world music scene. And the world music came onto the stage worldwide, in the North America, Europe, and then much more pervasively from the 80s onwards, and has often involved various kinds of fusion or synthesis, bringing together music from different places. This music scene, Israeli ethnic music, was constituted by musicians from very different backgrounds. So going back to my initial interest, I wanted to see how they would interact. How do they, if they don't speak the same musical language, how are they going to make music together? This was a puzzle to me, it was a puzzle to them, and they found some pretty interesting solutions. They had a few record labels that sprang up to support them. There were a few venues, there were a couple of agents or managers or producers middlemen who made this work. It's a minor scene, but it has moved from the very edges into most people's cognition. And bands would go abroad to tour. They tour the United States, they tour Europe, sometimes other places as well. Several of the bands that I'm talking about tonight performed in Hong Kong at the Asian Music Festival in alternating years. So remember I talked about Musika Mizrachit, this popular Israeli Mediterranean music. Well, these people marketed their music as distinct from it, as deeper, as more, as just smarter music, and also as different from art music. Here's some of I'm going to just give you a list of some of the preferences that characterize it, and then I'll play you a couple of examples. So acoustic instruments, they prefer the oud, the instrument that Yair Dalal was playing in that first clip, and other acoustic instruments like violin. A prejudice against synthesizers. Synthesizers and electric drums or drum machines were pervasive in popular music in the 90s. They still are to a certain degree, and they were really, really widespread, and these people were not having any of that. A commitment to hand drumming, so not stick drumming, but hand drumming, and various Middle Eastern drums on which to do it. And then the patterns of different sounds that form the basis of various kinds of Middle Eastern music. They reject the drum set that all of you have seen used in jazz bands, rock bands, and so on, and that's used in many kinds of popular music. So it's not that they completely rejected it, but it's pretty rare in this music. And on the other hand, they turn to modes, to ways of making melody that are reminiscent or sometimes taken directly from Arab, Turkish, Persian, Indian music, klezmer, Balkan music. So some of this if you've done much synagogue going with Ashkenazi melodies, some of this would be very familiar to you. So here's the beginning, that we come back to Yair Dalal. This is the beginning of a piece he wrote that came out in 1994 on an album, Al-Ol. Al-Ol is a desert whirlwind, a little whirlwind, and the Bedouin have a story about this, that it's a genie, that's a jinn, that's whirling around and around as punishment. So the music is kind of like that. But here's the opening, which starts out with vocal and in a very Middle Eastern style. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I added my notes there. Yeah, and then you'll hear clarinet, but a kind of clarinet playing that might sound familiar to you from klezmer. It's actually, the guy who's playing it plays a lot of klezmer, also plays a lot of Turkish music, and which uses a different clarinet, a different type of clarinet. They're playing in a mode called Saba, which is a very, very sad mode. So if you have any musical chops, you'll hear that it's a scale that just sounds very different. And there's oud, the plucked lute, and drums. Let's hear a little bit of this. Sorry.
Aman aman, aman, aman aman, aman aman,
So this piece whirls round and round like the whirlwind. It's quite obsessive and trance-like, and I've heard Yair Dalal perform this for 5 minutes, for 7 minutes, for 8 minutes. There's more to it than just what you've heard, but that's now he's set the stage, and those are some of the elements that you'll find used in other pieces by him and others as well. The other, one of the bands I'll be talking about is called Bustan Abraham or Bustan Avraham, and this is a composition called Fanar, and I've taken a small excerpt from the middle just so you can hear some of the complexities when somebody who's steeped in Arab music takes some of the language of Arab music and is working with somebody who's got conservatory training in Western composition and thinks about counterpoint and how to make different melodies fit together. And here we have the oud, the plucked lute, playing one repetitive pattern. We have the bassist playing another repetitive pattern. We have the drummer playing yet another pattern. And we have a violinist playing over it and playing in what he would call a quote-unquote Eastern style or an Arab style. That's very emotional. So that's two tastes of the kinds of elements that they're using. There was a lot going on in that. I don't know how much of you could hear. It's pretty transparent on the one hand, but if you don't do a lot of technical listening, it might not all come through to you. It's not typical of Arab music. In other words, some elements typical of Arab music have been piled on top of each other in a way that would come much more naturally or quickly to someone who's been trained with Bach fugues and so on. So why at this time and why in this place? Why in the 1990s and why in Israel? I'm going to try to set up or lay out some of the fundamental reasons for why this was, the time was ripe. There were considerable socio-political changes in Israel at that time. there were very, very deep divisions, social divisions and political divisions. The first Palestinian uprising against the Israeli government started in 1987. By 1991, it was kind of on a low flame. There wasn't as much violence, but for Arab musicians in the West Bank or the old city of Jerusalem, it was pretty miserable because the leaders of the Intifada had forbade celebrations with music. So weddings, which were the life and the bread and butter of a professional musician, those weddings couldn't have music anymore if they were anywhere that was under not the jurisdiction, but the direct influence of the leadership of Palestinian resistance. For Arabs living and playing in Israel, that was not such an issue. But it was a real issue for some of the musicians I'm talking about. It affected everybody's life in one way or another. There were also really deep divisions between secular and religious Jews. And I remember being struck by the fact that when the first Intifada broke out, there were some ultra-Orthodox Jews who were watching the clashes between Israeli military police and Palestinian demonstrators so they could learn the Palestinian tactics for when they would be fighting the Israeli police. So it's a complicated situation. Those are some of the rifts. But what was going on at the same time is that there were peace negotiations for the first time, really, not between Israel and other Arab countries, but for the first time between Israel and Palestinian organizations, the PLO in particular. First in Madrid in 1991, and then secret negotiations that led in 1993 to the Oslo Accord, which turned the PLO from a terrorist organization to it legitimized them as the Palestinian Authority and created certain conditions that we won't go into here. We could talk about later if necessary. At the same time, there was a grassroots turn towards dialogue groups. So Arabs and Jews, Palestinians and Israelis, who said, this isn't being resolved very quickly by the leadership. Let's see what we can do, how we can learn about each other, how we can find some common ground. Sorry. Right, that was the next one. So this was all important. It affected everyone. Most of the musicians I interviewed said this was not the main purpose of their going into this musical field. They didn't think they were going to solve any of these problems through music, but some of them thought that they could help bring people to a better understanding of each other. Culturally, there was growing openness to other kinds of music. So when I say other, I realize that's almost nonsensical. Music other than the standard popular offerings or classical offerings, but reaching outside of the comfort zone. More and more people were interested in that. Record stores and radio stations were starting to feature or at least carry some of that music. And this was fed partly by the massive immigration from the former Soviet Union. So I mentioned earlier that there were immigrants from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and so on, Uzbekistan in particular, who were bringing their music to Israel and starting to teach it, for instance, at Bar Ilan University outside of Tel Aviv. There was a rise also of Mizrahim, of Mizrahi Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa, who had been on the margins of Israeli society to a large extent, certainly when it came to the airwaves and the concert halls. And they were starting to really gain a voice and gain more support and more attention. There were more Arab citizens of Israel. Some of them would call themselves Israeli Arabs, some would call themselves Palestinians or Israeli-Palestinians, but I'm talking about a particular group of people who were going to universities and particularly to music academies and getting music degrees, and they're encountering Western music in a more technical manner. So developing the competence to collaborate with musicians trained in Western music. That wasn't their goal, but that was a side effect. And finally, particularly Arab musicians would complain to me about a kind of stagnation because they weren't finding outlets for their creative impulses. Their musical life consisted mainly of playing at weddings, playing the latest hits, and it was just not, it was like being a bar band, which can be fun for a while, but it was not what sustained them. So these are all things that motivated people some of the musicians, to turn to new paths. There was also a taste for the exotic. And one of the musicians, one of the Israeli Jewish musicians, I remember telling me that, well, not telling me, he was on a panel that I was on, and saying how he was curious to hear Arab music up close in his first collaborations, and to sample what he called all the new tastes at this restaurant. And these musicians often used food as a metaphor for music and musical mixing. So there was a desire they were looking for new opportunities and sounds, and there was a desire to create a unique presence in the developing world music market, something that would put them on the map. They saw Israel, and they promoted themselves and Israel as a crossroads, a cultural crossroads, a melting pot, or a mosaic. Different people's. The main thing is that there's all these different kinds of music. Look at how rich we are. We can draw on all these resources. We're creating something that's never been heard before in the world, and it's only possible here in Israel, because only here do you have all of this present, and you have people coming from these different angles and working together. So, to the musicians, I'll take you through three groups. Bustan Abraham, or Bustan Avraham, you heard a tiny bit from them. This is a group that was formed in 1991, and I'll go through the history a little bit in a minute. I've chosen, so the name Garden of, or Orchard of Abraham, Bustan, is a word in both Hebrew and Arabic. It actually comes from Persian, and it means slightly different things, whether it's a garden or an orchard, depending on the language. Abraham, of course, is the forefather, the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So they chose a biblical figure who would be a symbol for their unity. These are 5 Israeli Jews and 2 Israeli Arabs, both of them Christians. I don't think they were excluding Muslims or Druze Arabs. It just didn't work out that way. They started out with 10 or 11 musicians, and it boiled down to 7 as people dropped out or were asked to leave. So they came from very different trainings with different kinds of instruments, and they all composed pieces, and every composition was a group effort. One person would bring his ideas to the group, and the others would work on it and suggest changes and so on. The 2 pieces I'm excerpting here are by Taysir Ilyas, the Arab musician standing directly in the center holding his oud, and he's the one playing the oud. The first one's called Jaz Karkurd. This is a play on words. Hijaz Karkurd is an Arab scale or mode, maqam, but he's brought in some jazzy or bluesy elements, and so he changed Hijaz to jazz. And it starts with a duet or a back and forth between his oud, which he's playing in this rather non-Arab way, and Miguel, the guitar player's flamenco licks. Sorry. Oh, media, oh, that didn't transfer over. Did this one not transfer either? That would be too bad. Oh, gosh. So the video transferred, but not the audio. You know what? In the interests of time, I have it here, but it's not plugged into the sound system. Let's move on, and if I can, we'll figure out a way to do that. I'll play it for you later. Let's just talk about how they came to it. In brief, no, there's no point. I'll come back to it later. We'll hook up the sound to my computer and play those for you. So this is the formation of Bustan. I'm not going to walk you through the whole diagram. The point of putting this on here is to say there was one man, Avshalom Farjun, he's the guy holding the trapezoid off on the left, that's called a kanun. He's an Israeli Jew whose family he claims has been in Palestine for 220 or 30 years now. He's studied Arabic literature at the university, and he has been a producer of world music in Israel, bringing in musicians from Japan and Turkey and India and so on, and eventually decided he was going to put together a supergroup of ethnic music with musicians from different origins, and that's what you just saw and didn't hear, Bustan Avraham. But before that, he was a producer for Habrera Tivit, one of the first, really the first world music band in Israel, and he managed to entice two members of that band to leave and form this band. There's other things happening there. So this is Habrera Tivit. They were the ones who first brought Indian music, Moroccan music, Afro-Cuban, Spanish, you name it. I mean, it was really a grab bag of music, but they were beautiful combinations. And from that, Miguel, the guitar player, then met Taisir, the oud player, and they created a duo. They called it White Bird because they were interested, as a Jew and an Arab, Christian Arab, in representing peace. They were interested in leading people to peace, consider peace through their music. And then here's Bustan, their first album. The two of them are standing front. And from the last album, the two of them are still there. Somewhat less hair on the guys, but same band. The band existed from 1991 till 2003. So 12 years it had a run, and then ceased to exist. It fell apart for various reasons. And several years later, 4 members of the band came back together again. First for a gig in Boston, and then in Israel, and then I managed to get them to come to San Francisco for the Jewish Music Festival. And here they are performing in a synagogue in San Francisco. Later, inshallah, God willing, we will see a video of them. I hope it will sound. Let me pull the plug. Is Jeremy still here? Yeah. Jeremy, do you think we could will it mess things up if I plug the audio into my computer for an example?
Oh, go ahead.
Because so the audio files did not go over.
Yeah.
Let me just, thank you. Sorry, let me. Oh, you can't find can't find the presentation now. Oh, I know why. Sorry, guys. With you in a second. Okay, here's Bustan Avraham, the first example. So this was exciting music. Nobody had ever heard anything quite like that. Just to remind you, this is the group you were just hearing. And audiences loved it. I went to performances of theirs in Israel and in the United States, and it was very enthusiastically received. Here's the second example, which is an older one, Hamsa. Let me just say a word about this. This is from their last album. It was called Hamsa, which comes from the word for five. It's the hand that wards off the evil eye is Hamsa. It was their fifth album, and every track on the album had something to do with the number five. So this is the title track, Hamsa, and all the music is organized in fives. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's not it's not two fives that match each other. The first one is 3 plus 2, the second is 2 plus 3. And it starts out at a nice slow pace, and then there's what's called a metrical modulation, where the beat gets, I'm getting technical here, sorry, for at least 2 people in the audience, the beat gets subdivided into 3. So instead of da, 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 and that becomes the new beat, and it becomes very fast. So now we have 5 plus 5 going 3 times as fast as it went before. And there's a melody sailing over all of that. 'em. And then, towards the end, we're back to the original slow tempo and this original melody. I'm sorry, you just have to go out and listen to this for yourself. Look it up I'm pretty sure it's on YouTube. So Hamsa by Bustan Abraham. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and this is the product of the work of people who were trained in Arab music, but also were trained in jazz and also trained in Western classical music. It all comes together here in something that no one of them probably could have dreamt up on their own. Let me move on to another group. I realize this is, because of the technical difficulties, is going on a little later than planned. Alea Zait, the olive branches, or they call themselves the olive leaves. So they chose a band name that symbolized peace. There was a pretty explicit goal here. This band was formed by the woman in the center, Shoham Einav, was her stage name. She was she's still alive, but she was a highly trained nurse, head of the cardiac unit at Hadassah in Jerusalem, and a singer also, but not a professional singer. And she started singing in her 40s. She started performing publicly. Before then, she'd only sung in the home and for friends and family. And she was doing gigs with a keyboard or a guitar, and it just didn't satisfy her. She thought she wanted to stand out from the crowd. She had some other vision, and she decided she wanted some Arab flavor to what she was doing. And through friends, she found Jamal Said, this drummer here. Jamal is an amazingly diversely connected person who was a TV star, a comedian, but also a well-known musician with many, many connections. The two of them went to Italy to play for a Jewish organization there, Jews of Libyan origin. And the organization loved them so much, they said, come back, we're going to organize a concert for you in Libya. And they said, we can't do a whole program, just the two of us. And Shoam asked Jamal to get together a band of friends of Arab musicians. So this was more or less the band he pulled together. And supposedly Muammar Gaddafi was supposed to be present, and the whole thing got canceled. There was one of the periodic blow-ups in the Middle East, and that never came to pass. But they had a band, and so they were going to do something with that band. And this is a band that devoted, very different from Bustan. The people were less musically trained in academic terms. They were focused on, almost all of them except for Shoham came through the typical sort of Arab popular and folk and art mix that was common at weddings and other entertainments. Shoham was singing Israeli folk songs, Israeli popular songs, and Ladino ballads that she learned from her grandmother. And they were giving it an Arab flavor, as they said. Here's what they did to a song that some of you should surely know. Sorry, I have to get to the right slide. How many of you know that song? Yeah.
Is there a relation to Habustan and Bustan?
Yeah, it's let's go into the orchard.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly that word. Yeah. So Erev Shel Shoshanim is like a quintessential Israeli quote-unquote folk song. They did this with several of these songs, songs that have been in the Israeli common repertoire since the 1920s or 30s, some of them slightly more recent additions. And then Jamal also taught Shoham some Arabic songs, popular songs. The band lasted for about 10 years, a lot of trials and tribulations. The members, some were, the violinist was an Israeli citizen. None of the others were. Some of them lived in the old city and had Israeli residence cards. Some of them lived in the West Bank. And whenever there was whenever there were roadblocks and so on, it was impossible to come to rehearsals. Numerous cancellations of concerts they were going to do. This was during a period of suicide bombings and other kinds of upheavals. And somehow they stuck together. They made it to Hong Kong to perform at the annual Asian Music Festival. They made it to Switzerland to perform. They never made it to the United States. And they were not household names, or they were not even widely known like Bustan. Back to our beginning, Yair Dalal. So he's the one we heard at the very beginning singing with an Arab singer. He's had a very, very diverse career. You see him on the top of an album he did with a group of Bedouin musicians, and down below with a group of Israeli musicians that he called Al-Ol, which is exactly that desert whirlwind that he wrote a piece about. And these musicians were playing Indian sitar, and this is the clarinetist you heard before. He's playing a Turkish clarinet, and she's playing Indian tabla. And this guy is another son of Iraqi immigrants. I can't even see which percussion instrument. I think it's a tambourine that he's playing. Just to give you a sense of Yair's very diverse connections, he's deeply involved in the Jewish ethnic scene. All the black ovals are musicians. All the red circles are CDs, and the blue hexagons are bands. So he has led bands, and he has played in bands led by others. He's put out CDs under his own name. He's been on other people's CDs. He's done that with older Iraqi Jewish musicians who were his teachers. They were the ones who initiated him into the technical side of the music he had heard growing up. And he involved them in his recording projects, and he brought them to the stage when they were in their old age also. He worked for a while with Palestinian musicians from Jericho, but at a certain point, roadblocks and other restrictions made that impossible. But those were the two guys who went to Oslo with him in 1994 to play at the ceremony commemorating the Oslo Accords. He played with the Bedouin, who you saw in that picture. He played in contemporary art music. He played on a CD put out by the Israel Philharmonic, where members of the orchestra played pieces composed by various composers who drew on Central Asian, Arab, Turkish, and European resources to create compositions. No improvisation there except by him. He played with Jordi Savall. Jordi Savall is one of the leading performers of Renaissance music in the world, phenomenal viola da gamba player. And he wanted somebody, he was reconstructing old music that would have been at least partly improvised, and he wanted somebody who knew how to improvise. And none of his musicians, who were all trained in European classical music, knew how to do it. So he got a Jewish guy from Marin who studied Indian music with Ali Akbar, and he got Yair Dalal, so a sarod player and an oud player, to come and join the ensemble and improvise on this medieval and early Renaissance music. And finally, he joined the world music world out there by playing with two US-based musicians on their album. One's Turkish, one's Israeli, but located in LA. So a whole world of connections, and this is an old diagram. It's grown since. Let me see, I know we're getting a little bit, let me bring it, yeah, this is actually where I wanted to be. So I started this with the Oslo piece, the Oslo ceremony. 1994, Yair was kind of an unknown. He was not a teenager anymore, but he would have been in his late 30s. So he had a career doing other things, but he'd been playing music, and he had helped compose a song called Zaman Salam. You heard a little bit of it. And he was approached somehow, through some connections, he was approached by a Finnish singer who wanted to put together a concert in Oslo, in Norway, in commemoration of the signing of the Oslo Accords 1 year earlier. And Zubin Mehta, the great conductor, called him up and said, I want to conduct the Norway Philharmonic playing this. So it was this amazing confluence. And the Finnish singer said, and we need choirs. We need a Palestinian choir, a children's choir, an Israeli children's choir, and a Norwegian children's choir. So this massive logistics went into this. Shimon Peres, who was then the foreign minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Authority, were both in attendance, and they were so moved by the performance, the story goes, that during the intermission they went backstage and signed additional parts of the agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So Zubin Mehta and the Norwegian Philharmonic, Israeli-Palestinian and European singers and children's choirs, and then Israeli and Palestinian instrumental soloists, including Yair Dalal very prominently, and the two Palestinians you saw at the bottom of that diagram that you all memorized in all its details, right? Let me see if I can find the right slide here to play this for you, since I'm doing, yeah, okay, here we go. So this is Zaman Salam, time of peace. You'll hear a little bit more of this than you'd heard at the beginning of the talk. You'll hear the chorus. So they're saying Zaman Salam, Inshallah. So they're singing in Arabic. There are other parts that are in Hebrew, but not the part I'm playing for you. A time of peace, God willing. And then you'll hear, so this is like an anthem that they're singing it, all the orchestral and vocal forces together. And then there's a violin solo by Yair. I don't remember whether I put him playing oud at the beginning or not. Sorry. Yeah. This is the very beginning of the piece, and then it'll jump ahead. Okay. Let me make some concluding points. I had more, but I don't want to hold you too late. What happened next was, first of all, the murder of the Israeli Prime Minister, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and a whole wave of suicide bombings and other attacks that really derailed the careers of all of these musicians periodically. They would always come back, but each time they would never know whether, when they made plans to perform outside of Israel, whether they would be disinvited or not, or whether they'd be able to travel, and even concerts inside Israel were in question. But they persisted, and they valued their connections with each other, and some very strong personal connections were formed. I want to make, in conclusion, just a few points about this. These people were part of a somewhat larger scene, but they were very central to it, that created a new musical language. It's not a single language, but it's a new kinds of mixing, just the ideas of ways that you could bring these resources together. And this created the demand for new kinds of competence, new kinds of ability. So people were looking, young musicians were looking for ways to gain this knowledge, and coming to these musicians for that training in some cases. So several of these musicians started teaching in various programs at the Hebrew University, the Jerusalem Academy, and elsewhere. These bands arose, a third point is these bands arose out of completely separate professional musical networks, an Arab one here, a European classical one there, a jazz one there, and so on, and brought things together. And finally, and perhaps most important, is the performativity of this, the performance of being together. The fact that you had Jews and Arab musicians on stage together, not just for a one-off performance, but actually creating music, working on music for months, and bringing it to the stage, and not singing to each other, I love you, or we will live in peace forever, but finding ways to make mutually enriching music together. So those are some of the takeaways, that despite tremendous obstacles, they were able to accomplish this. And if we had more time, I would talk about what came after. But that was the 90s. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to stand here so the people watching at home can see us. So thank you so much, Professor Brinner, for this fascinating presentation. I think anyone interested in music or Israeli culture or of the interplay in the Middle East probably could take a lot away from your insights. We have time for some questions. So Jacob, we'll go to you first, and I will bring around the mic. Yeah, and we may have some at home, which Lauren's looking at.
Thank you. This does not go to your theme of the unity of music and
Right.
culture and all of that. It's really an aside. In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about, I'm not sure I can get this exactly right, but you talked about kind of different schools of Mizrahi music, and how one group sort of looked down at the other. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So today, and for some time, Israeli popular Mizrahi music is very religious. It is overtly religious.
Right.
The lyrics come from Torah, they come from Psalms, they come from Proverbs, and this is a major feature of today's Mizrahi popular music. I'm not sure what that was like in the 90s, but my question is, does the overtly religious nature of the lyrics, the reason why one group of Mizrahi-type musicians look down on another?
Okay, that's a really good question. Thank you. I shouldn't make too much of the looking down on, but there was a certain sense that of technical and maybe music intellectual superiority on the part of people among those who I'm talking about, in that they know the Arab modal system. They know the technical side of how melodies are made, how they have been made for generations in the Arab world, how they've been thought about, and that it's not just intuitive knowledge. They know how to put it into practice, and that they know a broad number of different ways of making those melodies, whereas many of the musicians of Musika Mizrachit have a much more limited scope in that regard. Not necessarily in an expressive regard. They can be absolutely very expressive, but in a music technical sense. So that was one way. And I wouldn't place too much on emphasis on what I said about that. The religious nature, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the examples I was going to give for the Olive Leaves band, Alea Zait, one of their last recordings, which they never broadcast because they were kind of fearful of what the reaction would be, was lines from Psalm 147, Shabchi Yerushalayim, which is very widely performed. And they put together this massive 12-minute track, which started with church bells, the sound of the muezzin, and shofar calls. And then you have all these Arab Muslim men singing in Hebrew Psalm 147 together with Shoham. Yeah, so it was kind of mind-blowing, and they were afraid that some other part of them might be blown if they put that on the radio. The people in the scene that I'm talking about tended not to be observant. There was one musician in particular who became extremely observant, so much so that when I tried to introduce him to my wife, he wouldn't shake hands with her because she was not his wife. He can't touch her. The others, not at all. Yair Dalal, in his music, in his performances and his recordings, has included some religious songs, some piyutim, some hymns. One of the things that happened at the end of the 90s, so these guys were laying the foundation for this tremendous efflorescence of interest in piyutim, in these hymns that used to be sung in the synagogues, used to be sung mainly by men, and since the early 2000s have been sung in public programs, in programs, let me step back. There have been very explicit programs to support this. Beit Avichai is one organization that supports it. There's a program called Kihilot Sharot, singing communities. People who, paitanim, masters of piyutim, of these hymns, are brought in to teach on a weekly or monthly basis, and there are concerts. And there's an American ethnomusicologist, Galit Dardashti, who did her fieldwork on this back in the early 2000s or mid-2000s, and then later...
I worked with Galit in New York, yeah.
Small world. Galit is also a cantor, and she's also the granddaughter of a very, very, very famous Iranian Jewish cantor, and a fine, fine singer herself. One of the things she talks about, stealing a little bit of her research, is that the men who taught these classes found themselves confronted with a group of students that included women. It included secular Israelis as well as religious people. They felt, well, I can't do this. And she talked about two of them whom she'd interviewed who had actually gone to their rabbis several times over. Can I do this? If I do this, is it okay? Yes, you may do this if it's only for this purpose. Well, now, and so this was to allow women to be present in the room and singing. And then the class is going to be performing these piyutim on stage. Can women be present? Well, I guess. And I don't know the whole religious justification. And the next one, well, can a woman sing a solo? So step by step, some of these barriers, these orthodox barriers, were broken down. I don't think it was a linear progression. A lot of these performances involve instrumental accompaniment as well, sometimes by Arab musicians. And the Jewish musicians, instrumentalists, the younger ones who play, often come out of the training given by people like Taysir Ilyas and Nassim Dakwar, the Arab musicians performing in Bustan Avraham. So although these are two very separate worlds, they're actually interwoven. And one of my claims is that what was going on with the ethnic music scene in the 1990s laid the ground for the ability to draw the reservoir of young instrumentalists who were fluent in this music and could play to accompany the Piyutim.
I want to ask a brief question from home, and then I know Gordon's got a question. And by the way, Galit and I did a Shabbat program together on the Upper West Side when she was training to be a cantor back in my New York days. I've been very blessed with the musical partners that I've had over the years, including
That's
Gordon.
Great.
So this is from Roberta Solomon, and she asks, are you familiar, another New York-related question, are you familiar with a club in New York called Noga, or Noga? It's been closed for many years, but they played a lot of Israeli ethnic music.
I've heard of it. I've never been there, and I really know.
Okay, and I lived in New York for a long time. I never heard of it either. Gordon.
Yeah, I doubt if there's a documentary, but I would love to see a documentary on how this whole thing was put together. But my question, my question is first, with the varying, people from all over the place. Nowadays, this would be easier with the internet and all that. But how did they practice together? How often did they get together? And who arranged that entire piece? Just how was it? I guess there's a lot of pieces of that question. But.
Right. Excellent question. So Yair Dalal's wife at that time, they're no longer married, is a Norwegian Jew living in Israel. She has all sorts of connections. She worked her connections with the Norwegian embassy in order to get visas and all sorts of logistics. She also is a documentary filmmaker, or at least she became one. And there is a documentary called A Time for Peace. You can find at least pieces of it. I don't think that it has this. What I found on the internet didn't have the subtitles, but I would poke around. Her name is Yvonne Dalal, Y-V-O-N-N-E Dalal. Kahan Dalal. So they didn't rehearse together until the last minute. They couldn't even get the Palestinian and Israeli youth choirs together until the last minute. But one of the things you learn from the documentary is this very heartwarming, is the friendships that were formed by these children while they were abroad in Norway together. To another part of your question, how was it arranged? So the story is that the song actually originated was composed in its first guise by an Israeli soldier who had been wounded while on duty in the Gaza Strip. He'd been hit in the head by a rock, and he spent several months recuperating in hospital and came to the realization that war was not the answer and there had to be peace, and he wanted to write a song about peace. He was a member of a kibbutz, and there was an Arab who worked at the kibbutz, I don't remember in what capacity, who was also a poet. And they started talking, and this poet wrote a poem. He wrote lyrics for the song. I don't know if the original composer, his name's Abutbul, wrote the Hebrew lyrics, or whether the Arab musician, whose name, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting at the moment, wrote the Hebrew and the Arabic, could be. Somehow Yair Dalal, he was at the same kibbutz, he met this guy. Yair was at the kibbutz playing violin as you heard him playing, with this kind of weeping, very emotional style, and the young guy who'd been wounded just broke down sobbing. And he said, I've never had music touch me in that way. Can you do something for my song? And so they started a collaboration. And then when it became this big production, Yair Dalal had some musical training, but there was no way he was going to write a score for an orchestra. So he approached one of the most famous arrangers and prolific arrangers of Musika Mizrachit, of this East Oriental pop music, who has a lot of experience. This guy has many, many hundreds of songs to his credit, many of them very, very popular. And he put together a score. I have no idea how much that might have been tweaked by Zubin Mehta or members of the orchestra, but he put together a score, and that's how that worked. And then there were intensive rehearsals when they got to Norway.
We have time for maybe one more question. Anybody? I have one if no one else has one.
And I have two little snippets I've got to play for you
okay.
to end with.
Anybody? Otherwise, I'll ask just a really quick one. So you talked about Central Asian music, and I traveled through Central Asia in 1993 through a Jewish organization. And one of the countries I traveled through and spent about a week in was Uzbekistan. And I heard a lot of music among the Jews that I was spending time with, and it was haunting and beautiful and exotic, and I had never heard it before. I'm just curious because Central Asia is a pretty remote part of the world, and a lot of people are not familiar with its various cultures. In the 1990s, when this music was really flowering, would you say that it wasn't one of the dominant threads, but it was there?
It was there, and it was interesting because, as I mentioned, at Bar Ilan University, which is a Jewish religious university just outside Tel Aviv, somehow I don't know the background for this, but the music department hired some Bukharan, I think it was, musician to teach, and various musicians. Jamal Said, this Palestinian drummer in Jerusalem, started teaching at a music school in Jerusalem right on the border of East and West that was founded by a Persian Jew, and he was teaching Arab drumming to a whole raft of Jewish and Arab students, and alongside him, or in the next room over, there was a new immigrant from Uzbekistan who was teaching music from there of one sort or another. So, and then Avshalom Farjun, the producer who put together Bustan Avraham, had a record label, and he started putting out records by some of these immigrant musicians, as did others. So there was a real interest in this, that way beyond what you might have expected otherwise. Yeah, it was obscure music for most people. I should note that there's been a lively Bukharan Jewish community in Jerusalem since at least the 19th century, and they were documented by an early ethnomusicologist at the turn of the 20th century. He devoted 10 volumes to 10 Jewish communities in Jerusalem, and one of them was the Bukharans. So they were 1/10 of this collection. Ashkenazim were 1/10.
Interesting. And now there's a huge Bukharan community in Kew Gardens in Queens, believe it or not. When I was there, they were either going to Israel or they were going to Queens. You have a couple pieces you want to end with. Before you play that, let me just ask everyone to give Dr. Brenner a round of applause.
Thank you.
I want to thank you and Lisa for coming up to the wilds of Napa from Berkeley. I want to thank our donor for making this possible, who wants to be anonymous, but we are incredibly grateful. And thank you so much for your insights and wisdom and scholarship. And what do you have for us now?
So I wanted to play, I had promised that I would play Bustan Avraham, the Bustan Quartet, performing in Berkeley. This is just a very exciting ending to a piece composed by the bassist early in the band's career. Sorry, I'm having trouble here. Oh, sorry, I need to put the sound back over here. Ooh, sorry, did I just blow the sound? I hope not. Yeah. Oh, no, yeah. Because the video did transfer
correctly.
Yeah.
Just one moment.
Tell me when.
Go ahead.
That drummer, Zohar Fresco, is absolutely worth following. You should look him up. And if you're wondering about the impact of this music, the bassist, Emmanuel Mann, who composed the piece, found that a Japanese group had played it, an almost exact transcription, although they don't sound as good, of the piece and posted it on the internet. You get the point. That intensive rhythmic work, incidentally, is from India. That's their experience playing with Indian musicians, from which they took this idea of repeating something 3 times and moving where it sits in relation to the beat. It's very, very exciting, and they would never have come to that on their own if they hadn't played with Indian musicians. But to have a band in Japan take this up and play it just shows how widespread and unpredictable the web of world music is. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you.